Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with just Stefan Bertram, and today we are going to be talking about euthanasia and its relationship with capitalism, and specifically kind of the decline of capitalism, the position where which the modern state feels the need and is pushed by the public to take on kind of care of life for everyone, and how these things intersect in such a way as to mean that any kind of lived system of euthanasia within a capitalist state, I think is going to be very bad. Also, going to be trying out a different system for the arrangement of my notes and your comments. So, live comments are going to be appearing on the right from the start, shown on stage, and then I've got the teleprompter feature also on, but I'm not actually going to use the teleprompter. I've just got my notes in StreamYard. So exciting times. I won't be having to use two tabs or to use a PowerPoint. I'll be on screen, and also there's space on the right for people's comments to go. I quite like this idea. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to begin with the idea that Canada has euthanasia, and the situation there is bad. This shall be our axiom for the day. Of course, to be clear, in Canada, there's the idea, probably in Canada and also outside Canada, there's the idea that like Canadian euthanasia is mostly killing like sad 12-year-olds, which is not the case. Overwhelmingly, still in Canada, the people being killed are the elderly who have some kind of terminal end of life illness. That still forms 97% or something of like the number of people that are euthanized in Canada. But there are also people who have been killed otherwise. And the fundamental problem, is there never seems to be a stop, never seems to be a break. Rather, each year, more and more die this way, and the definitions and restrictions upon the system die out. The question then becomes, is something like this, like what's happening in Canada, and seems to be happening in the Netherlands, and seems to be happening with the political process of imposing this system in Britain, is this something which is peculiar, contingent on the peculiars of something to do with Canada and its political economic system? Is it something contingent on capitalism, or is perhaps there's no way to have a moral system with euthanasia at all within a state system, or perhaps even more broadly, even in communism, anarchism, medieval societies, we would be unable to have a moral euthanasia? As I mentioned, similar problems to the situation in Canada seem to be emerging in the Netherlands and the UK. Euthanasia, beyond being a system in which you kill particular people who, in some sense, desire and need to be killed, but it also can be, or is, a political solution to the problems of disability and aging, and is not merely a humanitarian form of mercy killing. But let us first discuss mercy killing. Mercy killing is something which, as soon as we produce the extreme examples, I think is very much clearly justified in at least some circumstances. If a person will only ever know sharp agony for the rest of their life, and this life will end very soon, what reason would there be not to kill them? Compared to other extreme examples that we would give in these sort of moral situations, I think euthanasia is notable for this is something which quite commonly happens. When people are dying, when they're reaching the end of life, their body is rebelling against them in such a way that they're in severe pain as they die, and will be in severe pain right till the moment they do die. Concerns about judgment and our capacity to kill would be the things that would hold us back here, but not actually kind of the moral. We wouldn't be like, no, we certainly can't kill someone in a circumstance because they are literally about to die. We can't do anything to hasten their end because, again, they're going to die. They're in great pain. And there's a useful kind of coincidence in terms of how our biology works, how common biologies work, that the same things that we use to relieve pain are the same things that depress our nervous system such that we're likely to die. And so this is why high dosages of morphine can be used both to ease someone's pain and ease them into death. It's this concern about a capacity in judgment is why we turn to euthanasia, because within the system of euthanasia, the question of judgment and capacity are passed on to people who make such judgments their business, doctors. This does raise a question that we'll attend to later of, do we degrade or damage the medical profession in some way by turning them into these polite executioners? But it certainly seems to be the case that doctors do have the education and the will to make end-of-life decisions, and do so frequently, as we would also have the capacity to create end-of-life scenarios based on a moral political framework. Sorry, to be clear, that was a bit of an unclear statement. We can create political moral systems outlining the circumstances under which doctors can kill people, and then we would trust doctors to reasonably implement these systems most of the time. Though notably, this moral political system would also have to be congruent with what the average doctor thinks if you actually want to implement it. But I would say that doctors generally are quite open to euthanasia. When are the reasonable circumstances under which it would be permissible to euthanize people? I've given the extreme scenario where someone is in great pain near the end of their life. Notably, this is a time where doctors will kill people, or if we're being kind of careful, doctors will take various actions that will lead to this person dying while having the intent of kind of easing their passing without euthanasia laws. In the UK, there were a series of court cases in the 20th century where a few times courts tried to try doctors who had clearly moved to deliberately kill their patients who were in a great deal and suffering at the end of their lives. And never once did a British court convict the doctors for doing so, as this was seen as a right and proper form of killing within the medical profession, even outside of a system of euthanasia. The problem I am seeing with having the comments on screen is that the StreamYard comments on screen are very teeny tiny. And so, despite them being there on the right without full screening and thus removing my notes from the screen, I am unable to read them. Hadron of Theseus said, while we in burden crawl towards death. While 250D says, I feel like you can ask if meaningful consent for anything can exist in the capitalism given we're basically being coerced all the time. I think the answer to that is degree we have to act like we can because doing otherwise is unworkable. Obviously, this is a question relating to, we can bring this question out in regards to like concerns about inheritance and us pressuring old people to die. And this isn't just something where, it's just greedy bastards doing so. If you're in a circumstance where either your grandparents' inheritance can ensure some kind of decent life for you via inheriting a home, or the alternative, under which they have a terrible life experience for a few years in a care home, and that paying for that care home leads to that property being dissolved and sold off, it seems right to pressure your grandparents into being euthanized, which is, of course, reasonable and at the same time very, very dangerous. Hadron says, Theseus says, it's just not a terrible episode quote from King Lear. No, it's a good one. I like it. Is Jack Cockhoverian a well-known name in the UK? I have not heard of him. If that's a person who is in the image, the image was suggested by, the thumbnail was suggested by the artist who makes them for us. The other problem is if I click off the teleprompter and go to read the comments, it does not keep my place. So for euthanasia laws, we would want to step further past what's already legal, of course, or already permissible, or already allowed by systems which allow doctors a fair range of end of life care options. The logical extension of this, and I think the idea that most people are sympathetic to, is a more drawn out account of the same thing. Not just when someone's immediately about to die or will die in the next days or something, but where someone is suffering, for instance, from terminal cancer. Um, we know that they will die, or there is a 99.9% chance that they will die. And in the meantime, they will suffer greatly. They will not have a life that is worth living. Even if their death is years away, in these sort of circumstances, we would also think it permissible to euthanize them. Someone who is terminal, or almost certainly terminal, and the quality of life is going to be bad for the rest of their life. This would be combined with the more subjective reality of someone giving up their will to live. So, of course, if this person is dying of cancer, but still has a gusto for life, and they dissolve their property and so on and do their best to the world despite the condition, of course, in those circumstances, we would not want to pressure or indicate or even suggest to them that they should be euthanized. As long as that will to life is there and there's some kind of bodily and mental capacity to back that will to life up, then we should certainly facilitate that. This brings up another point around euthanasia, and I think one of the key reasons that people are so iffy about the Canada model. People think that the only driving force behind euthanasia should be the person that desires it. The push for euthanasia should come from the person that's going to be euthanized. Wow, I'm ridiculously bosh at the end of that last sentence. And we also think, I think this is generally thought, I'm doing the thing I normally do, where it's an attempt to reconstruct common morality, but also to combine that with combine that with novel moral accounts from philosophers. And I think generally in this case, they're quite well combined. Everyone else in this process, we think, should act as at least a moderate roadblock to this. This is perhaps more fundamental to a moral euthanasia than the when of it occurring. More vital is the direction of who pushes for it and who resists it. A classic concern that I've brought up around euthanasia is the idea that people use it to bump off their grannies. We can't legislate this sort of internal family behavior very well, and we shouldn't enormously impinge human freedom in an attempt to do so. Ultimately, if someone is having a private conversation in their home with their grandmother about whether they should or should not be euthanized, this is something, apart from the most extreme circumstances, we should not try to legislate on, because an attempt to do so would massively impinge on human freedom. But what we can control, to a lesser or greater degree, is the orientation of medical professionals as regarding euthanasia. And it seems that in this case, they should be orientated contra death, that they should facilitate to some degree while also putting roadblocks in the way when people want to be euthanized. But they should at the same time facilitate and put roadblocks in the way instead of pushing for it themselves. This is, I think, one of the reasons that people are so put off by the Canadian system, where it seems the case that medical professionals will just bring up killing you. And kind of, it seems the case that while we're still in circumstances where few people that aren't terminally ill, old people, are euthanized in Canada, there seems to be increasingly a large amount of people in Canada who are being offered the option to die, which of course they will say, fuck off, no. But this isn't what you want for a medical system. This is not the sort of care that you want offered to people. And this, of course, combines with the fact, as we'll get to later, that Canada has a public health system where everyone can access it to a lesser degree for free. I think this question, the question of orientation, the question of who is pushing for it, rather than whether or not, in the end, they actually kill you, seems to be the thing which most degrades the medical profession. There's a variation of the trolley problem called something like the outland drifter. This is based on saving the same kind of thing with the trolley problem, where you're saving five but killing one. But in this case, a doctor is being asked the question of whether they would save 5 lives by killing a young man who's drifted into the doctor's surgery out kind of far, far away in the outback, say, of Australia or something. And you know this man, while he's a happy, healthy young man, you also can tell that he has no real family connections or anything like this, will not be deeply missed if he is killed. And you're asked why probably you approve of the situation in case of the trolley, but you don't approve of the situation here. Everyone reacts to the outland doctor scenario by being very skeevy of it, even if they approve of the normal trolley problem, and even if they approve of the fat man variation where you actively murder someone. But I think a key part of why this is so repulsive is that in the outland doctor situation, you play the role of a doctor. You are not an unindividuated individual, nor are you yourself. You're placed in the role of a medical professional. And in that case, things become a lot worse. Doctors, we think, should not actively kill, especially in the case of a young, healthy person who's not asking for it. Doctors should be orientated towards life and health, and the life and health of whatever person is at hand, especially, and should only edge from this when asked to by a patient in desperate need. Reconciling common morality is only half the project when I do these kinds of videos, but I do think the common instinct here is very sensible. The idea that a doctor should act to defend health above all else fits with every kind of common system of normative morals, and the secondary rule, and the only kind of possible system which doesn't, is a very sort of blunt utilitarianism, but I think any kind of utilitarianism thought at any distance would also come to similar conclusions. Just going to continue for a bit longer, then go back on the comments until I can only also put 5,000 characters in the teleprompter. So I now have to awkwardly paste the other half in while I look at the comments, but a couple of paragraphs first. But enough careful agreement. What are clear breakpoints around euthanasia? An interesting one to discuss is mental health. Mental health is never terminal in the sense that you only die from it. Only way you die from it is through killing yourself. But it can certainly create a great deal of suffering. And in some very broad sense, all humans are, of course, terminal. And having severe depression will significantly shorten your lifespan. What should we do in these cases? Surely there is a level of pain which would make it worth it. There's a level of pain and a resistance to treatment which would make it worth it. The problem, of course, in the case of mental health is that it's hard to assess, it's hard to access the pain of someone who is severely depressed in a way that assessing the pain of a kind of physical pain of a wound, of an injury, is much easier. I think the solution, again, is just barriers and orientation. I don't think we should say that, no, we cannot kill you because you don't fit a certain particular category of injury, but rather the point is to put up a lot of barriers to make sure that this person's life is really not worth living, and that they really, really do, in fact, want to die. And now I'm going to look at the comments. Ah. To defy these, I assume by right you mean in the sense of it being in your self-interest rather than morally right. No, I'm definitely always talking about morally right tonight. We're doing morals today. Kefkovian, Robert Carpenter says, divide an assisted suicide machine in the US. Robert Carpenter also says, interesting topic, and one of the central questions of Foucault of how sovereignty, the old power to take life or let live, evolved into the biopolitics, the modern power of make, live, and let die. Yes, we will definitely be discussing that in the second half of today. La Fin, Absolute Monde, possibly Jason, I guess. Don't know who else admins that YouTube. Says the answer is no. If you check the description, I also preemptively answered the question as no. Hi. 258D says, I feel like the medical versus social model of disability is relevant to debate. Like, presumably people might more likely to choose death if they have accommodations. Yes, this is the other problem where it seems to be the case that another danger of euthanasia is if you have the option of you can pay $10,000 a year to do this and that for a homeless disabled person, or you can just kill them. The second option, especially if you're trying to balance a budget, which everyone is trying to do now, councils, for instance, in the UK, local councils, local government, half their budget, a full half, I think it's 55% on average, goes on adult social care. If these councils had the option to suggest, oh, can we just kill you instead? That's going to be very, very appealing. And again, this is going to be one of the key questions in the second half. Yes, everyone can read that one out for themselves. I'm trying not to say KYS and the other word too much during the video. Hadron Thesis said, my problem with the thought experiments like this is the externalities, but they don't really isolate the question that they seek to. I mean, I think the Outland Doctor example is exactly trying to get you to think about, oh, okay, so what are the externalities? What are the externalities that make me think, oh, actually, I should reject this case while I wouldn't reject the other cases? In the cases, so that's why you're like, oh, it shouldn't be done because this guy's a doctor. Let me redo my notes. Why is it all in bold? So let's move on to capitalism. What is the fundamental problem here with the relation of capitalism to euthanasia? I really need a drink. This is bad timing, but I do. The strained Western social system, the pressure on which will only grow, does not wish to care for the elderly, the disabled, and the sick. It could solve this by killing them, or at least killing some of them. Each dead person is a relief for the system. And this is the fundamental approach, a barrier approach, the kind of the throwing up of barrier system I suggested in the previous point, or really any other approach under capitalism. Once the seal has been broken and any sort of killing is allowed, the economic incentive is just to push further and further. What percentage of the unkilled who would likely to be euthanized otherwise are going to go on to become normal workers that would contribute to the social system instead of draining from it? It's going to be very, very few. So all the incentive is to bump them off. This is reproduced on more particular levels. If you're an oversubscribed doctor's office, which they all are these days, who has the possibility of euthanasia, and you have a persistent, miserable patient consuming a great deal of your resources, why not suggest killing them? Why not evade the barriers? Why not put them up? Is it not, in the end, the best for everyone, including them? Notably, and something that makes this contrast, this problem, whatever you would like to call it, increasingly sharp, is that we live in an era of class hate, but where that class hate is being increasingly retooled into generational hate. The idea of euthanizing the boomer class is conflated with liquidizing the landlord class, and the idea that we could just kill them all becomes appealing. There's also a growing awareness that there are a category of persons out there in the world who are, for lack of a better word, crippled. An antisocial class of the permanently fucked up, drug addicted, homeless, antisocial, violent, criminal, not just kind of, not a drain on the system that a normal disabled person is, but someone that's an active, dangerous, violent criminal. And that these people have been just rendered into something decidedly other by the horrors of their lives. And without something like an asylum system, and a system of imprisoning the mentally ill until they become better. Again, the question in our capitalist moment becomes, why not just kill them? It's cheaper and more effective than all the alternatives, and can be dressed up as woke. As bigoted, because of course it's euthanasia isn't carceral. They don't go to jail, they don't go to prison, they aren't confined anyway, apart from being confined to the grave. As political possibility closes off, as hope diminishes, why don't we just kill them? Becomes appealing in a double manner. On one hand, we seek vengeance and retribution for whoever is continually making things worse. On other hands, we see the removal of parasites, scare quotes, as needed for the national renewal. Parallels, of course, here can be made to the efforts towards sterilization in the 1930s, but reinterpreted for our childless future. So is this a problem of capitalism, a problem of a particular form of capitalism, or a problem broader than that? I would say that the problem here is not an immediate one of the profit motive, the profit drive under capitalism. The disabled and dying do cost money, but they cost the state money. And costing money is a great way to make profit. While it's hard to squeeze money out of dealing with the dead. This is, of course, not a general profit to the capitalist system. And profit from care deepens the crisis of capitalism. Because not only do you have an increasingly large class of non-productive humans, but then you have a large amount of the productive humans caring for the non-productive class, such that less and less humans are doing anything else apart from dying and caring for the dying. But there's no reason for any particular capitalist to care about the general problems of profit. What's most interesting, I think the key to this problem, is the relationship of the capitalist state to the capitalist population, I should say. And of course, this is, pure Foucauldian biopolitics stuff. So we should ask ourselves, what is the ultimate role of the capitalist state? Well, in a broad sense, to ensure the continuation of capitalism. At one time, this meant the primary function of the bourgeois capitalist state was repressing and managing out the feudal class. At another, this had very much directly to do with repressing and managing out the workers' movement. After the defeat of both these groups, the capitalist state is more directly confronted with the task of managing the crisis of profit. This often just means directly giving various entities money so they can keep going. Money that is borrowed twice over, as we saw in COVID, where both businesses and the state massively borrowed, and a large amount of this was the state borrowing so it could borrow money out to capitalists, who then, of course, often couldn't pay, and the state still always has to pay. And if they didn't pay, it would lead to a different kind of capitalist crisis. This goes alongside the fact that the economy is increasingly oligarchical. Oligarchical? Yeah, I think that's it. And state-run, funded government spending an increasingly massive share of GDP. State spending in the UK, I think, is almost at 50% of GDP. In the West, we increasingly have a really shit version of state capitalism. Under this framing, the question is very clear on why we should kill the disabled and the elderly. They're not productive workers who contribute tax and instead massive drains. They're not, for the capitalist, necessarily a direct problem, but they're an immense and direct problem for the state. The capitalist state is interested in killing the disabled and the elderly for the same reason that capitalists are interested in firing ineffective workers. The capitalist state can be submersed entirely within capitalist logic in this way, instead of being a system which stands above such a operation and manages and defends it. Notably, this was not always a problem. In the 19th and the early 20th century, and certainly the case if we go back further, even if we ignore the workers' movement, managing the disabled and elderly was not something the state was deeply worried about. The excess could simply be thrown off, and the problem instead was a glut of potentially productive workers and little way for them not to end up below the possibility of reproducing themselves. Euthanasia, by contrast, is a solution to an era where the headline problem is retreat and decline, but also when we pass a stage of life management such that the state feels like it needs to be involved in this way. There were far less old people 100 years ago, but it was also not seen that the state needed to manage their lives, though this soon changed. It didn't. The fundamental problem here is not just that we have many, many old people, but that politics involved in such a way as it feels impossible to suggest that they just be left to their fate. The optimism and actually real progress of the 20th century allowed for the state to manage these things. But the state no longer has the capacity to manage these things, but cannot retreat from managing them because it's just politically impossible. And this is in circumstances where profits are going to zero and the share of government spending going on pensions nears 100%. Going to review the... Matt Gilbert says, how much of this is a capitalism problem and how much of this is a liberalism individual problem? I mean, go to Japan or anywhere else that has a more traditional culture that respects the elderly. I would 100% expect Japan to get into euthanasia big time soon enough. 25AD says, I feel like it's worth pointing out the bulk of the resistance to euthanasia actually comes from the hyper-capitalist religious right. I mean, certainly from the religious right. It's why my supervisor, Ashley Frawley, in her rejection of euthanasia, ended up allied with a far right-wing evangelical organization. I mean, the state does borrow. I mean, it also creates money, but I mean, you can say it creates money and then gives it directly to certain financial. Well, you can say the state creates money and then, in order to create that money, with that money, it kind of it just pays out money to financial organizations. But the actual structure is basically the same as if it lended out money. Of course, the capitalist state could be far more active and interesting what it does with the money supply. But I think the concrete reality is its current management of the money supply is not really any different from borrowing. Hadronothesis clarifies that earlier on he was talking about kind of older, more simple thoughts of moral thoughts experiments. Certainly. And also, we have the thing of we've never in human history confronted the problem that we have now where the population pyramid is inverted, where there are more elderly than young people. It's the first time in human history this has ever happened. And it's not just happened a little bit, it's happening decisively into a great and overwhelming degree. That doesn't seem like it has a possibility of changing. Can you not make a similar argument to that for sex work under capitalism? Maybe it's not ethical under capitalism, but restricting it is worse. I don't think this is particularly convincing because there isn't that much amateur euthanasia, or however you'd like to name it, while there is, a permanent degree of sex work, which doesn't seem to be something that any society's ever got rid of. Need to put the last bit of my notes in. Copy. But it's seen as utterly immoral and impossible for the state to just retreat on this point. No one suggests simply abandoning the old and the disabled, and the class of disabled, or however you would like to name them, and they live on the streets these days, couldn't be abandoned unless we abandoned whole sections of city, which does seem to be a certain strategy from certain liberal politics. Even those who hate the old, who hate the older generations, want a reckoning, not an abandonment. This places the capitalist state in an impossible position. There's simply not the productive capacity in the economy to cope, especially as they're required to sustain a great deal of their efforts. Under these, we return to the question of why not kill the old? And the answer would seem to be, in fact, that for the capitalist system to survive, they have to kill the old because they have to be responsible for them, and they certainly cannot pay for them. The sublation of the welfare state as capitalism reaches apogee will be in a form of a machinery for the management of death, of instituting early death for the sake of the individual and for the general mass. Power over life and death is not something that should be kindly handed out to the capitalist state. Sorry, this is to move to my suggestion. I am suggesting that power over life and death is something that we should not kindly and easily hand over to the capitalist state, and this is especially bad in our present circumstances. Ultimately, this is how we must answer all political moral questions. We should not ask, what in principle is the correct sort of free speech? What is the correct sort of euthanasia and the correct sort of smoking laws and anything like this? Like in an abstract sort of way. Like, what do we imagine would be the ideal form of smoking law, or the ideal form of euthanasia, or the ideal form of this, or free speech, or this and that, or whatever, absent any real political circumstances? But rather, we should ask, if we pass a certain law which says a certain thing, what will be the real effect of it? An example which always sticks to me, and I assume I'll remember the rest of my life, is an anti-vaping group has successfully got some city to ban outdoor vaping. But once the police slammed some black kid to the floor for vaping outside, they were all, oh no, this isn't what we meant. But of course, this is what they meant. This is exactly what they meant. This is a completely straightforward and predictable outcome of the law you pushed for. And if you didn't see it coming, that just means you're stupid and bad at politics and morality. So the question should not be, is it moral to euthanize people under some circumstances? I think the answer is yes, very much so. But rather the question should be, should we support legislation that will allow the capitalist state to massively expand its power to legally kill us? To which the answer would seem to be an emphatic no. The capitalist system, the capitalist state rather, is in a continuous battle to expand its power, and the evidence from countries which have legalized this killing shows no sign that anything is different in the case of this killing, that if granted this power, they will do nothing but further expand this power to kill more and more of us, and we should not go quietly into such a system. Those are my words for today. I'm done. Become a patron so Stefan can get better teleprompting software. I think next time I will actually try the actual teleprompter, which is directly on screen. I was actually just glancing towards the notes, which was probably obvious. But it was a thing where it just like I had to type. I didn't actually, sorry, to be clear, I didn't want it because it didn't really let me add my own thoughts. When I read out my notes, I don't actually read it fully formed like it's a speech or something, but rather I make various additions and so on and so on. While if I actually have like the real teleprompter scrolling on the screen, it kind of locks me off from really expanding unless I pause and fiddle and fluddle. Blah, 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 blah. Matt Gilbert, we're still talking about modern monetary theory. Currency sovereigns can always make any payments due as long as the real resources exist. But there are kind of objective facts about the amount of real resources that the capitalist state extracts from its population to pay its creditors. And these things are going up. Andrew Mulheron 1234 suggests Michael Gladwell once pushed pro-smoking propaganda talking about by saying that access deaths from smoking would save Social Security. Huh. Well, that's a fun one. And obviously, yeah, I think there are this Thanatos sort of drive sometimes. But of course, I think the argument is definitely not true. A massive argument made in the UK is actually you need to stop smoking for the sake of defending the NHS. That being fat or smoking or whatever else, drinking to excess, is a burden on our common health system, and thus you should stop. I think the evidence does point out that smoking does create more healthcare costs than it helps. Matt Gilbert suggests when resources start to run out, then they'll start population reduction. To be honest, there are far, far too many people. We're way past carrying capacity. I don't think we're way past carrying capacity. Only maybe within a certain political economic system, not in any objective or real terms. So yes, if anyone has any questions, comments, suggestions for next week, now is the time to make them. Otherwise, I will be knocking off for the day. Soon has already said thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Soon. I will line up the outro video. Which one should I do today? I might give the GTA people another heavy metal outro. Wojtlowski just says, "Damn Civil War." On that fine note, I think I'll end it for the day. Bye.